The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Leader. Today's guest, Adam Roberts, is a theater practitioner in Austin, Texas. He's also responsible for the version of the Black Crook Gallop that's the normal theme music for this show. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
We're talking today about musical theory and how it helps us better understand musicals. Musicals have only recently become subjects of sustained scholarly attention, and even then there's often been this assumption that we're supposed to look at them in the same way as a straight play. For instance, one of the readings that you sent to me before we started doing this interview was Joseph P. Swain's The Broadway Musical. And in his introduction, he talks about the critic Eric Bentley talking about Oklahoma. And Bentley referred to this as the work of Mr. Oscar Hammerstein. And anyone who knows the show might think, well, wait a minute, what about Richard Rodgers? Doesn't he also help create the drama? That's what you're talking about today. How does the music, the theory behind the music, help us to understand how the shows work?
That's right, absolutely. And it's interesting. I think there are a lot of variables, and Swain and others go into these as to why it might have taken so long for scholarship to catch up to talking about musical theater. And the sort of primary reason that is often posited for this is its popular nature. So having been a music theorist myself through training in graduate school, it was very interesting because I got to see sort of what musics and musical genres were sort of allowed into the canon of publishable musical scholarship, if you will. And it was very interesting because during my own sort of master's and doctoral work when I was a student in, at both of those times, there was mixed reaction to sort of writing about musical theater from a scholarly perspective. And certainly, although I've been out of the academic realm of that for about a decade or so, the ability to get musical theater scholarship published in a music theory world was at that time especially very sort of untenable. Every once in a while, you'd have something come out. But what's very interesting was, or what is very interesting about that to me is that as a director and as a musical director and conductor, to me, the practical side of all of this is actually really critical. I think a lot of times people hear about music theory or they go to music school with an assumption that music theory is sort of this thing you do for your first 2 or 3 years of school, and that's your rite of passage as a music major, if you will. But truly, the benefits of music theory to what we do as musical theater practitioners and even as theater historians is very palpable.
You've compiled this really useful reading list. I mentioned Joseph P. Swain's The Broadway Musical. We will post that list in the show notes. Now, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the structure of a song can help to establish character. We talked a bit about Scott McMillan's The Musical as Drama when we were preparing for this interview, and he cites some really interesting examples, such as the love duet where two people don't realize that they're in love. The famous song that comes to mind is I'll Know When My Love Comes Along from Guys and Dolls.
Yes, absolutely. So it's very interesting because when we're talking about structure and form in a music theory sense, we're often talking, we have to sort of discern, just sort of like in character arcs and things like that when we talk in a sort of a more traditionally dramatic sense of form. We have to distinguish whether we're talking about form as being where an individual song or an individual moment fits within sort of the larger, show itself, or whether we're talking about the form in an individual song or in an individual number. And in this particular case, I think you're referring to this example that is cited from Guys and Dolls, and also is true of so many musicals where the form itself helps to sort of drive home what happens in terms of character and plot and all of these things. It's pretty interesting that, we often think of two sort of really primary forms to boil it down, which is a verse chorus form. But then also the really typical form of songwriting in the Tin Pan Alley era was what most people refer to as song form itself. So even the name of the form is sort of, reflects that. So that is an AABA form, simply meaning that the letters themselves are not denoting any kind of musical pitches, but are denoting components of the song form. So this is where we typically get our 16 measures or 32 measures for an audition cut nowadays, is because back in this Tin Pan Alley era and sort of into the beginnings of the golden age as well of musical theater, roughly 1943 to 1964 or 65, it was very common to write in this AABA form where you would have 16 measures of a musical motif or theme or phrase. And then you have another 16 measures that, for all intents and purposes, is that same musical motif or phrase. Then you get to the B section, which is the bridge, or which in sort of old school musical theater terminology was often called the release, because it would provide a release from the sort of two back-to-back iterations of that same A theme. Then you come back to the A theme once more after the bridge, and you've got your 32 measures, 8 measures each. I think I just messed up when I said earlier 16 measures of each, but I meant 8 measures A, 8 measures A, 8 measures B, 8 measures A. So then you have your 32 measure song form that way. And so, oftentimes bridges work differently in terms of these songs. They're almost like little mini musicals in their way. Oscar Hammerstein often talked about to Stephen Sondheim and others about a song sort of functioning as a play in and of itself, as a microcosm of a play. One example that I could use is actually from my master's thesis, which was on all of the same sorts of stuff, specifically related to Jason Robert Brown's Parade. So something a little more recent, 1998. And in Parade, Jason Robert Brown uses this motif. It's the very first thing that you hear that's pitched. So you hear this drum cadence, and then you hear this little motif that ends up becoming augmented much later on, in this song, All the Wasted Time. So one of the things that you can sort of do is say, well, let's look and see where this theme or this motif is permeated throughout the score of a show. And then let's see what the connotations are, because what was the connotation set up in the beginning? Or is it sort of something that later on in a score, we hear the same theme or this same melody or the same phrase, and we relate it back to some sort of text or some sort of intertextuality. And this all sounds very academic. But as Stephen Sondheim once was telling Mark Eden Horowitz, in his book, I think the example Sondheim cites, they're talking about Into the Woods. And I think Stephen Sondheim says something like, talking about a given interval, I think he might say the interval of a second, may not be that helpful in those terms with an actor. But to be able to say, look at this whole surface and look at how these things are intertwined intentionally. Now, as opposed to discerning what might the composer have intended for that, because that's a whole other sort of discussion. But what might that mean in terms of my going after this sort of thing as an actor? So when we look at all of these different elements of music, form, structure, it's kind of similar but different, harmonic analysis, all of these sorts of things. And as you said, you're going to post, I think, the readings. Folks can go and read, if they're interested about the, like, for instance, all of these references of Guys and Dolls. I will say that, in the musical as drama, Scott McMillan, he takes a kind of an interesting approach to this duet. He talks a lot about, love duets in this little section of the book. And one of the things that he sort of says is, from his critical perspective, a lot of these duets have the idea that although they're singing about not being in love, they're actually falling in love because of sort of either because of singing about not being in love or in that same moment. So you have sort of this crackle feature of this moment of intersection, right? And I think others might potentially argue that, in real life, many of us will sort of feign, not being in love, well before that sort of happens. So it's certainly something that can be argued, but just the way that he looks at this is very interesting, and especially how he looks at it in the context of the lineage of musical theater history, because, he talks very much about how, of course, coming from Viennese operetta and all of these sort of roots that musical theater comes from, American musical theater, he talks a lot about the differences in how the structure has played out, as a dramatic agent through the ages, and that this is a particular twist on the love duet that is sort of unique to American musical theater, especially around this time.
He also talks, another sort of example of a single character revealing character through the structure of song. He points to Henry Higgins, who does very interesting things with the structure of his song until the very end of My Fair Lady.
Yes, absolutely. What's interesting is what he's talking about is sort of how Eliza, she is I think he uses the word something like, she's a good little girl or something like that. She conforms to the structure of the traditional structures of her song. She sings what are essentially simply constructed songs in terms of structure itself. And Henry Higgins, in order to always be the one-upsman, if you will, or to be seen in a certain very unique way, according to this particular reading, always is having to sort of contradict to the formal constructs of the simple, structure of the song until the very end when, such a famous ending to a musical and its textual ambiguity and sort of plot ambiguity, but the way in which the form of that final sort of song, that final sort of moment comes to match hers in its simplicity is really a great example of dramatic. I mean, there's very little doubt that could not have been an intentional choice when you see the patterning of the way these characters have been treated dramatically from a musical perspective throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah, he says that the fact that they rewrite Pygmalion to have a quote-unquote happy ending, sure, it drives a lot of people nuts, but at least the music is there to sort of support that character choice, whether you like it or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the thing, music, and this is something that is very common in musical criticism generally, but also comes out in sort of all of these readings that we've been looking at, is, unlike language where you can sort of convey one, I suppose people would argue with this too, but linguists and things, but where you can sort of convey one emotion or one thought or one sort of thing like that at a time. The beauty, of course, of music and of polyphony and of these ensembles is that you can have 5 or 6 different emotions going on at one time through a musical kind of framework. And I certainly think that this is another example of how adding music, to go back to Eric Bentley, who I think he was the one who said, music never adds to the dramatic word or something like that. And I think that became less and less at least a very prominent position in his writing as he went along as a critic. But I believe he was the one who said that. And it's interesting because this is a perfect example to me of really intentional thought that take away that musical moment or that musical underpinning or that commentary, if you will, musical commentary on the situation. And you've suddenly got a very, very different circumstance.
One other thing about a musical that Macmillan points out in his book is the fact that there's so much that you can gain from the ensemble. At one point he says there are one-character plays, but how many one-character musicals? Could you talk about some examples of particularly interesting uses of the ensemble? Maybe a sort of quick sketch of how this develops?
So one great example, I think, to speak to your point. I'm going to go backwards a little bit for a second in history. I always think that the use, Graciela Danielle's use of the ensemble in ragtime is really quite stunning visually. That opening number of ragtime in 1990, I believe 1998, just so smart and so evident. You don't have to sort of analyze so deep in order to get what she is going for. You have these three different communities, all of whom are costuming very differently, of course, but each of which has a very different movement vocabulary. But also, as you listen, you can hear what Steve Flaherty has done in the score, where you have sort of the nuances of ragtime, of this music. It's very meta in its way. You have ragtime as the musical underpinnings of this whole piece, this music that everyone was aware of, just sort of like the social context, and the music being a metaphor for what's going on here. But then, the way that the sort of privileged white community sings this, and the way that the immigrant community sings this, and the way that the African American community, the way that all of those different nuances of ragtime are treated is actually quite amazing. And because you can get all of those three things juxtaposed within the same number, again, the music is adding this specific dimension to what's going on in terms of the whole idea, the whole picture, because the staging itself is so great. But then also having, this klezmery kind of clarinet stuff going on, and allusions to other sorts of Eastern European things with the immigrant community. And then having a very different sort of what we would call a stride piano version of that ragtime theme, the very stilted sort of not swung version that you get with the sort of privileged white class. I think that is a really super cool way of using the ensemble visually, and in terms of music, and in terms of storytelling, a really brilliant sort of coming together. And the other, there are so many, could go on for days about this alone, but a chorus line, which is also referenced some in these readings. Very interesting, because a chorus line, of course, is celebrating that gypsy lifestyle of the Broadway musical theater performer. And originally, as most people who have read about chorus line know, when they were doing that workshop for a chorus line, they had written just sort of a moment for each character, and one character would step out of line and do their thing and then step back, and then the next one. And I think it was Donnie McKechnie who says, they were looking down the line at that first reading and saying, oh my gosh, when is this going to be over? Because it was literally just person after person stepping out and sort of talking and singing their story. And so Marvin Hamlish and Ed Kleban and Michael Bennett decided, well, hey, why don't we write this huge montage? Which then becomes framed by Hello 12, Hello 13. But, there's so much going on in that montage, and the sort of not literal voices of the performers, but the compositional voices for each of those characters is so unique when you sit down and sort of look at it and work with one of these performers, and you hear how unique to that person the music is. But you've got how many people on stage at once, over a dozen, who are each giving their own little specs to this story. And that is something that if you considered all of those being spoken at the same time, would obviously not work in the least, But when you take that musical element that you put into musical theater where you can have polyphony, so multiple things going on at once, it suddenly has the possibility of becoming really exciting and allowing you to tune in almost to the characters who you find the most intriguing or the most cathartic or whatever, because then you can sort of turn down and turn up the volume knobs as you will.
Another well-known ensemble piece that also kind of helps us burrow down into some of the very specific things that you talk about when you talk about how music theory helps us better understand character, better understand a show, comes from G. Officer Krupke, a number that everybody will recognize from West Side Story, and the use specifically of something called a tritone. And this is coming from a book called Melodies of the Mind by Julie Noggle.
That's absolutely correct. So the tritone really is an interval. So when we talk about intervals in Western music, we're talking typically about the distance between two notes. So if you think of a traditional piano keyboard, there are really 12 individual sort of pitch classes, as we would say, on that keyboard. So there are many C's on the keyboard or many F sharps on the keyboard, but they repeat, if you will, at different sort of octaves. And so the tritone is the interval that splits an octave in half. So you would think that that would be very consonant, sort of pleasing interval, and it can be in certain chords and in certain ways. But when used in isolation, the tritone is usually a pretty dissonant, perhaps one of the most dissonant intervals as music theorists are concerned. So that very beginning trumpet blast, which I think she mentions are the whistles in the movie version of West Side Story, goes right to the tritone, and also the Maria theme. It's really West Side Story is the sort of pinnacle example, perhaps, of the use of a single interval as a unifier throughout a show that has such specific and sort of undeniable implications in terms of character and mood and all of those sorts of things.
Just to wrap up, I'm curious if there's anything that you've seen recent on contemporary Broadway that does a particularly interesting thing, something about sort of the way that the music works to establish character, advance the plot.
So I think an answer for that is, and perhaps it's not incredibly recent, but recent enough maybe, is Rent. Rent is a show that I like to talk about a lot when I'm talking about the practical sort of implications of all of this kind of stuff that we've been discussing, because Seasons of Love, for instance, is a great example of a song where we want to have ensemble blends, certainly. But you blend it too much and lose too much of the individuality in the voices. And to me, that becomes just a little too untheatrical or unmotivated in terms of action, or unmotivated in terms of the conventions of theater beyond what one might hear on from a solo artist or a band, or in the popular canon that's outside of theater, if you will. So I always talk about Seasons of Love as a great example of, as a musical director, sort of being a dramatist as well, and having that agency and that discussion with the director about, okay, and a sound designer certainly, about how can we still achieve, a good sound, a sound that people are going to like, a blend. But if Rent is ostensibly about individuals in community, depending on who you are, who is watching it, we don't want to lose the individual for the community. We want to see both sides of that. And in my mind, the music in that particular song, the way it's balanced, the way you sort of still get blend while allowing for autonomy of timbre and individual sounds from the performers, is a great example of how we can have both of those things. We can see individual, we can see community, and hear both of those things at once. It can still sound good, but it can have dramatic agency too. And I think it's really important for musical directors to also conceive of themselves as dramatists, so they can have those kinds of discussions, have that kind of input that affects the theater part of musical theater.
Well, great, Adam. Thank you so much for an enlightening discussion. Like I said, we're going to post links to information about those books that you mentioned, so that if people are interested, they can read more. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.